I would like to open the floor for discussion. We can have your comments, your opinions, or questions. Just introduce yourself and direct your questions to any of the panelists in front. Mr. Azhar first. We take 3 questions first. Mr. Azhar, Mr. Azman, and Sham from UIA, right? Yep. Okay, please.
My question I would like to direct to Professor Ibrahim Musa. Just now in your presentation, you mentioned about those fighters who are volunteering themselves to go to Iraq and Syria to fight for the Islamic State. And you mentioned those who volunteered in the state of, in UK and in Europe, they coincidentally happen to be the dropouts from the society. I've been trying to put that into the local Malaysian context, and if I'm supposed to, based on what the mainstream media has been reporting, those volunteers from Malaysia who wants to go to the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq to fight, they coincidentally happen to be, on their background, educational background, they happen to be very well educated people from both extremes. Some of them could have doctorate from universities. Some of them are real doctors, medical doctors, engineers. Some of them are high-ranking civil servants. Some of them, on the lower end, are just traders, petty traders and all that. So I wonder, for the Malaysian volunteers who wanted to go there, what seems to be the main incentive for them to go there? I know you mentioned about utopia, but then utopia is something in their mind, you know. But if they do really want to achieve something, as you said, you can do something positive here in Malaysia. So what is the actual driving force that forced them to make them go there and fight to be a martyr, as you said just now? My second question is this so-called extremism, from the historical point of view, when was this extremism, especially the militant extremism, became noticeable in history? Or is this something of a modern phenomena, or was it there a few hundred years ago? And what is what you call the driving force that made this militant become noticeable today? That's all.
Assalamualaikum and a very good afternoon. I'm Hazman. My question will be directed to Professor Ibrahim Musa. I think you are the most apt to answer the question because you teach moral philosophy at the university. My contention is that one of the reasons of the emergence of extremism is what I call the tension of justification, for the sake of not having better terms to use. Because in one of your papers, tension of justification. Because in one of your papers entitled "The Dilemma of Muslim Human Rights Scheme," I believe, you argued that the Muslim conception of human rights can be constructed from the basic theological doctrines of Islam, and then based on rational arguments, those conclusions can overlap with what we call the so-called Western conception of human rights. So you attempt to establish a very rational theoretical justification on those human rights scheme. However, this one of the belief among Muslim youth, the Islamists particularly, they say that Islam is not just about rationality, because it will also comes with what God has already revealed in the Quran and the Prophet said in the Sunnah. Because if we could see one of the political action in Islam, which is the law on adulterers, in hudud it is very clearly stated that one of the hudud punishment is on adulterers, and this cannot be justified rationally. So this will lead to a slippery slope, saying that Islamic politics is not about rationality alone. but it will also be based on God's judgment. So we need a state which will follow God's judgment. And I think this is one of the driving force which prompts people to follow what the Islamic State is doing, and most of the violent Islamist movements in the global arena. So my question is, where and how do we locate the debate between rational justification and theological doctrines? I mean, what we believe God has ordained us in constructing our political decisions, and how do we channel our political discussion in this area? Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm Dr. Isham. As you presented, as your presentation goes, and also the video, as I was looking at the video, you sort of trivialize these fundamentalists. You sort of caricature them, and as if they are very, very silly and very, very stupid in a way. In a way, I do agree with this sense. But in order to engage them, we actually have to try to understand them and what motivates them. And if we just simply trivialize what they believe, we're not going to be able to actually have any discussion. If we talk only among the converted and say, oh, we need to see things, everything figuratively, but they see things literally. And this solution to go back to just what you correct your ahlak is not going to work. It's just as the video went, oh, they should go back to the mosque, go back to prayer, salah. And they don't want to go back to the mosque. They want to actually leave the mosque and with the salah, change the world. Now, how they're changing the world, that's the question we have. Now, if we trivialize them, well, we'll never engage them. We'll never try to understand them, and we won't be able to debate with them. Speaking among the converted is easy. Speaking with the enemy or speaking with the opposition is the challenge. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me start with the last question. I don't think one should trivialize the fundamentalists. I don't think what we were addressing here are some of the big issues. What are the causes of that? And I'm sure that, to my knowledge, what people who espouse Salafism and what people who espouse other kind of doctrines that lead to violence is what is a very kind of a simplistic and a lack of complexity. And which another way to put it is also, one of the things that the larger story that I tried to telegraph in my earlier comments was that the arrival of Islamic reform, and people like Islamic reformers and others were telling Muslims that they must read the Quran. So Muhammad Abdu, Rashid Rida and others are saying Muslims should be reading the Quran. In other words, they must be directly in contact with the teachings of the revelation. Now that was and one of the reasons they did that was that they believed that Muslim orthodoxy were really not getting onto the program of understanding a changed world and how they should be adapting to the changed world. So Abdu and Rashid Rida were fighting mostly with ultra-orthodox ulama who were not getting with the program. So for instance, Muhammad Abdu would say that the ulama of Al-Azhar did not want to read Ibn Khaldun. They said reading Ibn Khaldun is not part of our tradition. Whereas Ibn Khaldun, as our scholar here knows, is one of the great minds that Muslims have produced. So, but when they produced the remedy that Muslims must start reading the scripture for themselves, one of the big lacks has been that they did not provide a methodology of how you understand scripture. So everyone, this is what I believe begins the Protestantization of Islam and a departure from tradition. Muslims always read tradition through complexity. Tradition teaches you complexity. So one of the things that many Muslims used to say, oh my God, is the ulama that is making Islam difficult. Islam is simple, but the tradition makes Islam difficult. That's precisely the issue. Tradition is understanding history, is understanding human beings, understanding spirituality, is understanding the divine. These are complex issues. This is what the tradition puts together for you through modalities of thinking, and they are multiple, they are not singular. And what happened is that with this reformist trend came the dumbing down of Islam. Islam became dumbed down. So what you see, what you have in my view, the do-it-yourself version of Islam. In other words, anybody can do Islam. You can pick up the Quran and read, and knowing one verse, you can do jihad. Chop off their heads, cut off their heads. And so this is the dumbing down. I call it in America, you can't understand it here, but the metaphor I call it in America is the do-it-yourself Islam. In other words, the Home Depot version of Islam. Home Depot is where you can go buy your tools and fix your house. It's called the do-it-yourself version of Islam. But there's also, in modernity, the rise of Protestantism was precisely this move, the rejection of tradition and taking ownership away from a certain kind of religious authoritarianism. The church was in cahoots with political power that created authoritarianism. So when a certain brand of Christianity responded to this authoritarianism in the church and against politics and feudalism, because feudalism and the church were in cahoots, the baby got thrown out with the bathwater. That's a problem that Muslims also are facing, that with the rejection and the kind of backwardness of the ulama, and trying to fight them and trying to enlighten them and rejecting them, did we also not throw away the complex tradition? And one of the biggest problems that I'm going to talk about this afternoon is that Muslims have become illiterate, and therefore the dumbing down of Islam has happened, and therefore you have this lazy version of Islam. So fundamentalism catches on to some of your pathologies. Christian fundamentalism, Hindu fundamentalism is all about identity questions. What is my identity? And then your identity is made simple. You wear a beard, or you wear a hat, or you wear a hijab. That is your identity, is reduced to 2 or 3 things, and your complex identity is forgotten, and with the result that now you hold on to those things against all other things, and the rest of the world must deny or must be changed in order to conform to this. It's a much more complex issue. And fundamentalism, there's been a lot of studies gone into that. I wish the fundamentalists were here today, one could have a productive debate. You're absolutely right that we are preaching to the converted. Let me address the questions that were raised. For the first question, you're absolutely right. This is not only a question of bread and butter and poverty issues. It is also the question that some of the most well-qualified and elite Muslims are having the same kind of utopian dreams and produce nightmares for us. So you're absolutely right. These are qualified physicians, doctors, engineers, and others who are doing that. So here's the way that I begin to think about that. It's clear that those individuals and Muslim society, and this is across the board, you find this across the board. I would sit, so for instance, with Muslims in their living rooms and talk about a progressive understanding of Islam, and Islam that is both holds on to tradition but also renewing itself. They would agree with me 100%. Tomorrow morning I come to their business place and say, listen, you must give me a donation. I got a student who must do a PhD, or I need for this kind of educational cause. And they would tell me, you know what? I'm facing such a big tax burden. I'm facing so much difficulty. I have to pay taxes now, and I really don't have spare cash. 10 minutes later, an imam, a preacher with a long beard and a turban will come and say, listen, there's a mosque on the corner there. It's not completely built. We need $500,000 to fix that mosque. And you know what? If you complete that mosque, or you put in the carpet of the mosque, not only will you get the reward, but remember your mother died 10 years ago, your father died 25 years ago. If you do this in their name, everybody's going to pray that, cha-ching, there's going to be credits happening there. You will get the reward, your parents will go to year after, redemption straight away, and you will go to paradise, you do this. So they understand this, what I call cha-ching Islam, the cash register Islam. Okay? Islam has a cash register. You hit the buttons, you get the numbers. They don't understand the Islam of complexity, the Islam of Ghazali and Ibn Rushd. It's a simplistic version of Islam. So that's the one. It's a kind of what we call a Islam that is now being monetized. It is become now a commodified, the commodification of the tradition. Okay? Some aspects are taken to me. Second thing is this, that those people who are highly achieved, they study at the best universities in the West, they come back and they have this. I face colleagues like this all the time. I have big arguments with them in the US. And that is that despite because they're intelligent people, they think about the world. They carry the burden, just like you and me, about the ummah. So we do not deny them that they don't carry a burden and they don't carry the pain of the ummah. Not that. They are just as pained about the crisis of Muslims. The thing is that what they don't understand is that despite this achievement, their world is not coming right. And by their world, they mean they are not getting power. The Muslim world is the richest in the world today, in terms of, but they are the most despised globally. Despised in the sense, people just want their money, they don't want their character, they don't want their history, they don't want their civilization. But everybody wants to sign up an Arab sheikh to support them in one way or the other, to do business with their money in Wall Street or in Throgmorton Street in London. Okay? Everybody wants Arab money, but no one really wants the history and the values of the Arabs, or the Muslims for that matter. East Asia is also quite rich. So this is the lack of powerlessness, despite having all the accoutrements of modernity, having all the tools of modernity, they are not successful. There's no global respect for them. So they think that establishing a state, establishing instruments of power, that they will regain the world's respect. That's what is happening to your engineers and your highly elite people. It's a psychological burden that they cannot understand, that they've done the same trick that everybody else does, and yet they're not getting there. So this is their shortcut. Well-intentioned, but as it is, the path to hell is paved with good intentions. And the question is that power does not only happen through capturing the state. What Muslims have not understood is the concept of soft power. Soft power is when you love your neighbor. That is power. Power is not a bad thing. Power is in everything in our lives we have power. That's one of the great tributes of Foucault. Foucault understood power in much more. When a preacher preaches, it's called pastoral power. There's pastoral power. Power is productive in our lives. But what we have misunderstood is that power, as the Prophet ﷺ said, smiling in the face of your brother or your sister is a sadaqah, is a charity. That is soft power. That is how you win people. You gain their trust and you can form community. That is power. But power can be done in a brutal way, and power can be done in a beautiful way. What we have mastered is brutality, not beauty. What we lack is aesthetics. We love beauty. Mahasin, ihsan is all about Islam. Ihsan is about the beautification of the world. So that's what it is. So the explanation, or part of the explanation, I don't think I've given full explanation, but is about Muslim elites who are highly accomplished, have a lot of money, because everything, but their hearts are with Al-Qaeda and ISIS, their hearts are not with us. And why is that? That is the question. It's the same thing that Imam Hussein was told by Farazdaq. When Hussein went out to go and fight the Umayyad tyrants, Farazdaq told him, Hussein, the people, their hearts are with you, but their tongues are against you. Okay? Their hearts are with you, but their tongues are against you. So, or not the tongues, their swords are against you. Okay? Their swords are against you. They are going to go with the brutality of power. And somehow the brutality of power has an imagination that Muslims accept. And that is because the self is weak. If you have a powerful self that you can stand up to tyranny, then you can see the beauty. But I also don't want to exaggerate that just protest is going to be all the answers. You need to find ways of doing soft power that you can be able to overthrow brute power at some stage, but it doesn't happen overnight. So the reason why many of these people are going out, because they think this is a shortcut to redemption. Shortcut to redemption. And part of these that we have been ingrained in our minds through a certain kind of Islamic literacy, that you must have a certain kind of Islamically coded political order for you to have legitimacy. So they live in Malaysia, but they believe that they're living in an order that is kufr. The nation state is not Islamic. Everything they do, they feel tainted and contaminated and polluted. This is their psychology. So no matter what Malaysia gives them, no matter what South Africa gives them, they feel that they must aspire for some kind of ideal order which they believe is the truth, and that's what they want to establish. So it's a psychological game that is being played, that they don't understand that this is legit. The question that the gentleman asked about the question about reason and what it is precisely that the lack of literacy and the thinness of the literacy of these fellow believers is precisely that they don't understand Islamic history and Islamic tradition. Muslim jurists, what was the job of Muslim jurists? They tried to find that teachings that were given by God and the Prophet, that where the reasons were not given, jurists go and try to find the reason, the illah, to find the illah, to find the ratio. Some rules you don't understand the ratio, so why do you pray 5 times a day? Why do you make hajj and zakat and so on? These are divine commands. But then how to operationalize hajj, how to operationalize zakat, you need to have certain kind of reasons. If you have so much income, then your zakat kicks in. If you have less income, those were established through forms of reasoning. But the original command that you have to obey the Creator, there's no rationale to it, but you can form a ratiocination for it. So the way in which belief and what we call metaphysical truths, truths that might not be understood through reason, but which gives you a solidity in your being, those are much more complex issues. And yes, but it's a lack of knowledge that people don't understand of how, for instance, the hudud worked in Omar's time. Why some penalties Omar said that will not be applicable. Not only during time of famine, but there are other instances, for instance, when Omar disagreed with some of the other companions of how to apply the hudud on adultery and others. It's the ignorance of Muslims of their own legacy that creates this kind of one-eyed approach to the world, not two-eyed approach to the world. And so I think that we need to understand that. And where do we locate the debate? Where do we locate the debate? To locate the debate is in complexity. We have to locate the debate in complexity. There are no simplistic answers to the world and to life. And not to make it impossible that you can't move forward because it becomes so complex, but you need to have a reasoned conversation. You see, I can say, I saw a dream last night. But you can say, I had a nightmare. But if I can explain my dream in a reasoned conversation, then you and I can share that understanding, that what it means. You can understand my psychology, why I didn't sleep well, and why did the dream mean X and not Y. So the reason is the basis for taklif. Obligation in Islam is based, and you must be compos mentis, you must have reason, and you must be able to engage in reasoned debate. That's when you get moral obligation. Moral obligation begins with taklif. Taklif begins with reason. If you don't have rational capacities, you are forgiven. You are pardoned immediately by divine command. Okay? You get a pass, as they say. So I think that we should not undermine the place of reason, but there are other things that I will talk this afternoon that will try to illustrate some of that mitigating complexities. Maybe Prof can add some.
I just wanted to add a couple of things. First of all, the statement that the gentleman over there was suggesting about perhaps we are trivializing extremism. And I don't think we're doing that. I think I was trying to say that we haven't even begun to seriously study it. We haven't gone beyond making remarks and statements about certain views or opinions associated with Salafis. In Malaysia, for example, we haven't studied it systematically. Research projects. We don't even, if you ask people to mention who are well-known Salafi preachers, they probably couldn't even do that. Whether Malaysian or they're probably more familiar with foreign Salafi preachers who come to Malaysia than the local ones. And what is more important to study is the way in which Salafi ideas are spreading among people without them realizing it. For example, you have a mosque where they stop practicing Maulid or reading the Ratib, or they stop performing a loud dua, that kind of thing. These things happen, and people fall into these new practices without realizing what is happening to them.
Creeping Salafism.
Yeah, you can call it creeping Salafization, you know, adapting from the term creeping Islamization. So this is also happening. So you have official systematic Salafi ideology, which has to be studied. Then you also have the phenomenon of people being influenced by Salafism without them realizing it. So now, I am not under the illusion, and I'm sure Professor Ibrahim Musa is not under the illusion that we can change, the scholars and the ulama who are Salafis. And it's not certainly not my, view that we should change them. And they can't be changed, just as they cannot change us. I am concerned with the next generation, and I'm concerned with our religious education. See, our religious education is sectarian, it's very literalist, it's based on a one-sided understanding of God. We are educating our children into feeling afraid of God rather than loving God. That stress on love is not there. The kind of stress that you find in the Sufi traditions of Islam, that is not there. People are told about the punishment in the grave. Death is therefore a horrible thing. Unlike what Rumi said. Rumi, in the Masnavi, he talked about death at Shab-e Arus in Persian. Shab-e Arus, the wedding night. Right? Why? Because the wedding night is the night you look forward to being united with your beloved. So Rumi is trying to say to us that far from being afraid of death, I look forward to it. Now, how many of us are educated in Islam in that manner? That we learn to cherish life in this world, but at the same time look forward to death. So our education system is all wrong when it comes to the creation of moral, ethical human beings. So this is what we need to work on. But I'm not optimistic, because I don't think there is any will, as far as our political leadership is concerned, to do that. So it's really a terrible situation. I also just want to say very quickly, because somebody asked about whether extremism is something new. You see, it is nothing new in Islam. The Khawarij were probably the first extremists, right? And some of the ideas that the Khawarij had are similar to modern day Salafism. And then we can think of many examples throughout Islamic history of extremist individual scholars and movements. But there is a big difference between the past and the present. In Islamic history, generally, an extremist movement lost ground and fizzled out. For example, you had the Zahiris, a very, how do you describe them? A very literalist school. But it died out. And then you have the Murji'ah, who is also extremist in the other sense, right? Stressing more the batin rather than the zahir. But these schools generally died out. You had Ibn Tumart in I think it was 11th century Morocco, captured state power, kind of extremist orientation, with many similarities to modern day Wahhabism. It died out. Many other examples. Now, historically, ideas that are akin to what we call Salafism today did not gather state power and did not spread globally. But it did happen in the 20th century. Why? Because of historical accidents. For example, you take the ideas of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. He managed to get the support of a family, the Saud family, which managed to get state power, which managed to get the support of the British, and later on the Americans. And very important, that state happened to be sitting on oil reserves. Now, if there was no oil in Saudi Arabia would be like Yemen. And there would be no global spread of their ideology. But because of these historical accidents, and of course the fact that they have oil means that they continue to get the support of the British and later on the Americans. For these reasons, these obscurantist ideas could gain global currency, right? So I think we need to understand the historical and the geopolitical context in order to understand why Salafism has spread. If there was no oil in Saudi Arabia and there was no US and before that British support, Salafism would have died out, like its predecessors, throughout Islamic history.
Can I just add one thing? Yes, the Prof rightly reminded us about that question that someone asked. Is this a new phenomenon? There's a book by Muhammad Qasim Zaman called Radical Islamic Thought in a Modern Age. Yeah, Radical Islamic Thought in a Modern Age. I just finished reading that book. It's very interesting that in 19th and 20th century India, as ulama were trying to work against the British and so on, you have exactly the same kind of thing of some ulama at first wanting to use violence and force to overthrow political power. You also have in Southeast Asia, people were using jihad as a way to overthrow political power. Then the first Muslims that came to South Africa, Sheikh Yusuf of Bantam, was a revolutionary, and he was brought to the Cape. I don't know how he dealt with the whole question of what his views were here, but I know that the Indian ulama, some of them changed their views and said, we believe that a non-violent way forward is better than the violent way. Because there's a huge risk when you unleash violence, you create so much instability that you might even miss the opportunities that you would have through a non-violent approach. Now, and I think one of the things that we also misunderstood, Muslims have globally misunderstood, is that the exercise of violence historically in the Islamic tradition was only legitimate the right of the state. Now everybody thinks that they have the right to exercise violence and so on, and that is what has to be reviewed in much more complex ways. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for all the answers. And I think we open up for a second round. I saw Dr. Adis, you were to ask a question, and a few others. Yep, yes. Yeah, okay, come. And the third one? Yeah, okay. Yeah, three of you.
Given the fact that unprecedented fragmentation of religious authority has taken place, fragmentation of religious authority, inevitably has taken place. How useful is it to think of violent extremism as a manifestation of this fragmentation of religious authority? I think you have touched upon this, but perhaps in more direct terms. And how do we deal with this phenomenon of both crisis of religious authority as well as unprecedented fragmentation of religious authority in the modern age of the internet? One thing that has stood up in the context of Islamic State is that they have used the modern media, to their advantage, to recruit people, to indoctrinate them, because internet has been basically instrumental in them propagating their own views based on a particular interpretation of Islam. So how useful is it to conceptualize violent extremism as a manifestation of crisis as well as fragmentation of religious authority? And in the context of Muslim majority state, how do we politically deal with this situation? Am I clear? I think, Professor Musa, you are familiar with the work of Professor Abu al-Fadl. He has tried to make a distinction between authoritarian Islamic discourses and authoritative, as a way of kind of distinguishing legitimate versus illegitimate forms of religious authority. To what extent is that useful perhaps in encountering illegitimate forms of religious authority, you know. Perhaps maybe the audience might not be very familiar with this distinction between authoritarian versus authoritative religious authority. Also, how do we deal with contesting conceptualization of ethics? You know, if two people have incompatible conceptualization of what's ethical and what's not ethical in the context of defining extremism, perhaps Professor Alatas can address this question. How do we deal with incompatible, contested conceptualization of what an ethical deed is, or what's ethical and what's not ethical? And finally, there is some research on Islamic fundamentalism suggesting that violent extremism is, can be usefully conceptualized in terms of these individuals trying to prove their own identity as real Muslims. What is your view of that? You know, this identity, you know, proving one's own identity. I'm a real Muslim, therefore I am going to show to everyone else that I'm a real Muslim, and I'm going to join the Islamic State, and you know. So, yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Adis. Second one, please.
Assalamualaikum. My name is Fariza. I just want to say that I do agree with what Dr. Farid said about Islamic education. And for me, Islamic education create false conception actually. At certain point, it create false conception about Islam, and it's being imposed in the society, and it's very popular. And this raised my concern. It raised my concern actually, because I remember being in my class. I'm a postgraduate student, and then the thing is, when we discuss about Islamic values, and especially we talk about Islamic country, the Muslim students started to say that we cannot discuss this because we are not an expert, and it's really made me sad about that. And how I want to ask you how we can penetrate the idea of moderation when the other ideas of Islam is very popular and is gained more attention compared to our discourse. And should we take out this Islamic education from our education system and let the parents take the responsibility of their own children's faith compared to let the state taking the responsibility? That's all.
Thank you. Third one, please. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is T. Kelly. I'm from the Baha'i community in Malaysia as well, also with the Pure Life. You know, Professor Ibrahim, you have mentioned about these forces that's been changing the world from the 19th century to the 20th century. Things have changed so much so that even not only just Islam, but other religions having trouble to acclimatize with the new challenges facing that. So for this session, we are talking about Islam. Perhaps maybe, just like any other religions do, we have to recast religion of its truth in Islam as the universal principles in the light of this age. And we have correctly put that there's so much of these thinkers coming to reform or to have a understanding of what Islam in the context of its modern world. Now, my question to you is that, well, is this a growing engagement amongst these Islamic thinkers? And also, what is the conversation with the general ulama? Because it appears to me that the general ulama are still stuck to their old way of thinking, and so far may not be able to rationalize what is the morality, which Dr. Alatas mentioned about putting it into some of these questionable practices, that this cannot be done or that it can be done. So there is a kind of a vast disconnect. As a result, what happened is that the majority of, when we become adults, we have that kind of congregational attitude. What the mullah says, or the ulama says, we accept without questioning it. And for the fear of, if we question, we are against the Islamic view and that we are not Muslims. Then on the other hand, we notice that the young, especially when Dr. Ibrahim mentioned about being idealistic and romantic, really it's true, because when we are young, we are very idealistic and also full of idealism and also altruism. And that's where we thought about having the kind of concept of this romantic of having the caliphate of those years, the golden years of Islam. And we like to dream that it is what is happening for the world as a kind of solution to it. But I know it is rather simple in its thinking, but this is how the young mind thinks. Then how then you can address that? This is an issue, it is a long process of evolving of the historical process of humanity, that we cannot live in the past, but rather looking at the past experience and how we can move forward and thinking that the world is one, it's a global village. And that we have to reconceptualize our relationship with one another. My third question is this. You know, it is not just the Muslims alone, but it also is the, I would say, the concern of the other communities too. Because whatever happens in the Muslim community impacts on other communities too, also impact the world. And how can we be the response from the other communities in the common search to bring about a better civilization and a better just society? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. TK.
Okay, let me maybe begin with the issue of fragmentation of religious authority and also ethics that you raised. Now, I'm not sure what you mean by fragmentation of religious authority. If you mean diversity, that I think is something good. And I think that in this country, we lack that diversity. At least we do not allow the diversity to show itself and that diversity to be expressed. It seems to me that the problem here is not the fragmentation among the ulama, the religious authority, but the political support that is given to a certain way of thinking. You contrast the situation with Indonesia. Now, in Indonesia, we have the same kinds of problems as far as extremist ideas are concerned. We are anti-liberal here, we are anti-pluralistic here, we are anti-Shiite, we are anti-feminist, anti-everything. You have the same movements in Indonesia. The difference is the political, these extremist orientations are not generally given political support in Indonesia. And the Indonesian political environment is sufficiently free where people are able to fight back. People are able to, to write in the media, to write books. I don't know how many of you have actually observed this in Indonesia. For every anti-Shiite book, you have an anti-Wahhabi book. Shiites are free to publish their works. They can publish their works on Shiism, or they can respond to critiques of Shiism. They can have their majlis, during Ashura, for example, openly have their majlis. So you have that degree of freedom in Indonesia, which you do not have in this country. In this country, for example, in Perak and in Johor, Shiites have actually been arrested, detained for possessing Shiite material. Not for demonstrating, for just possessing Shiite material and for having, a Shiite majlis, religious function. So I think the problem here is that the more extremist ideas are given political weight by the political authorities. So I think it is less a problem of fragmentation. So that's, I think, one response. Now, concerning the issue of ethics, right? Society will never, individuals in a society will never come to an agreement on ethics across a whole range of issues. And it is not necessary for that to happen. It is unreasonable to expect people to agree on everything. I think what we need to do is to educate people about how to think about ethics. And I think, as a matter of principle, one should distinguish between relative and absolute ethics. You know, when I say relative, there are many issues about which the ethical position we take is relative to our society or to time or to our circumstances. Let me just give you an example, because this example comes to my mind easily. Smoking, right? Now, for most of the schools of thought and most of the ulama probably say smoking is makruh. Some say it is haram. But I'm not talking about this. I'm talking about the ethics of smoking. Now, in many societies, in many traditional societies, it is unethical to smoke in front of your parents. Do you know this? It is rude and unethical to smoke in front of your parents. It's rude behavior. Okay? Now, in other societies, it's not a problem. It's not considered to be... well, you know, my father used to smoke a pipe and cigar. And when I was a kid, well, not when I was a kid, when I became an adult, you know, he presented me with 2 pipes. And I think he was, before I went to my studies, I think he was afraid that I would start smoking cigarettes. So he gave me 2 pipes. Now, if I refused to smoke in front of my father, he would consider that, you know, not respectful. The other way around. Because, you know, pipe and cigar smoking was part of his culture. His father, even his grandfather, used to smoke cerutu. Those, you know, in Indonesia. My great-grandfather was in Indonesia, used to smoke cerutu. So, you see, it's a different situation. I'm trying to explain to you how ethics in this case is something relative. What is right and what is wrong in this case is something relative. In some families, it is rude to smoke in front of your parents. In the case of my own family, if I refuse to smoke a pipe or cigar in front of my father, he would think that I'm not being very respectful and not very friendly and not, you know, wanting to, to have a nice smoking session with him. Now, clearly there are many areas of life where ethics, where what is considered right and wrong behavior is relative to the society, to the historical period, to the time. But there are also other areas of life where ethics is absolute. Now, every society needs to have its discussions and its debate about relative and absolute ethics. But finally, in the ultimate analysis, what actually becomes law, what becomes the rule, what becomes the norm, is decided by consensus. It is decided by consensus. Because there are some issues that can never be resolved on rational grounds. For example, is the right economic system for a Muslim society more to the capitalist side or more to the socialist side? It can never be resolved purely on rational grounds and purely with resort to jurisprudence. It can never be, because you can find arguments for and against on both sides. So ultimately, the society will decide based on consensus. So this is what I mean. Now, the problem is not that we don't know what is right and what is wrong. The problem is we are not allowing for debate and discussion and then arriving at some consensus as far as the people are concerned. And also consensus, I mean consensus of the ulama as well as the people. We do not have a political environment that allows for this. So for example, there's no, to pick a trivial issue, but it refers to a serious problem, this touching of the dog, right? There will not be any public discussion and debate on this, because the authorities have decided what is right, so there's no discussion, right? The fact, and I think I mentioned this in previous talks, in the 60s, the Mufti of Terengganu had a dog, or had dogs. You know, he had Alsatians as guard dogs, and at least one of his children, whom I know, his daughters, had a pet dog. Right? This was the Mufti of Terengganu. While he was Mufti, this happened, and this was not an issue. In the 60s, it was not a problem in Malaysia in those days. And we can go further back to Kelantan. I think, I can't remember exactly when, it was the early part of the 20th century, where there was a discussion about the issue of dogs, and the result of the discussion was a very, an acceptance of diversity. People were far more closed-minded because they were traditional. Traditional means acceptance of diversity. So you had people who had what we would think of as closed-minded ideas, but there are people who had, open ideas. But what was important about, I think this is generally true of the classical Islamic tradition, that the diversity of opinions was there. And the state did not say that, you have to follow this madhab or that madhab. So to me, it's a political problem, that we do not allow for that diversity, we do not allow for the debate. Okay, I don't want to take too long. Regarding the question on education, what do we do with education? You see, the sister over there was talking about, what's happening in our education. As I said earlier, I'm very pessimistic. The education system will not change because the stakes are too high. Our education system is national, decided by the state, by the Ministry of Education. It will not change. Certainly will not change for the better as far as Islamic education is concerned. And even informal Islamic education also has its problems, like what you were mentioning. So I'm very pessimistic in terms of expecting change from the top. The only thing to do is for individuals, activists, NGOs to provide alternative education. Now this can be done through informal education. We should actually study the Indonesian model. You have groups, study circles, what we call usras, or you have this what they call majlis ta'lim. These are informal. This majlis ta'lim in Indonesia. Do we have majlis ta'lim in Malaysia? Huh? No, not like that. This institution of majlis ta'lim is very big in Indonesia. You have big, what they call tokoh Islam, scholars who, or preachers who, on a private basis, organize the funding, and then they have this kind of informal education, which is quite institutionalized, but it is, it doesn't come with a degree or anything like that. Now, these are the things that we need to develop here to re-educate our people about traditional Islam, about the need to respect diversity, and so on and so forth. I think there are many ways in which we can introduce in an informal manner, which can be effective in terms of the spread of the ideas. I think this is what we have to do. This is a kind of jihad, actually. It's a jihad. It's a struggle. It's a struggle because you are up against a formal education system. You're up against a battalion of closed-minded and even extremist bureaucrats and ulama. So it's a very uphill task, but I think this is the only way we can begin. And hopefully in the future, in the next generation, when, and again, I'm being very realistic, not your generation, but your children's generation, that these ideas would have spread sufficiently where they would constitute an important force that the government would have to reckon with, and that there would then be, they would constitute an electoral force, and they would have some impact on elections. Right now, people who think the way we think have no impact on the elections. That's why I'm not hopeful for change coming from the top.
Thank you so much. Let me just add a few things, maybe a little bit more humorously. So the dog story is a big thing in Malaysia.
Oh, yes.
It seems that you've been dogged by this problem. I wouldn't say that, but you can say it. I can't say it. I'm a guest here. Your Professor Kamal Hassan many years ago wrote a wonderful long essay on dog saliva and Kelantan, what you referred to. In some royal house, they had pet dogs and what is the status, and they used the Maliki ruling instead of the Shafi ruling. etc., etc. These are old issues. Islamic law has multiple opinions, and what you can take. But even more exciting is the fact that in a surah, a chapter that Muslims read, or at least traditionally read every Friday, there is a story about this young group of people who leave an oppressive society and they seek refuge and they fall asleep, the Surah Kahf. And there God explains that group of pioneering people, and guess who does God include amongst those people? The dog. And it says the people speculate how many of them are they. وَقَالُوا خَمْسَةٌ كَلْبُهُمْ سَادِسُهُمْ, and there are 5 and the dog is the 6th, and some says there are 4 and the dog is the 5th. The dog is part of the community, and here you're fighting about, the community, and here we're fighting about can we touch the dog or not. And the Quran says that did they have the dog in quarantine? Was the dog separated? They had to feed the dog. So we have developed an attitude towards the dog. It might be that the Shafis pushed too much emphasis in dog saliva being prohibited and so on and so forth. In fact, you need to understand that the hadith and these things talk about that you need to treat your cats and dogs as tawafin. They are like your household pets. And sometimes brushing against them doesn't mean that you become impure. Maybe the dog saliva has a special status, but the cat saliva has a different status. These are amazing issues that Muslims have thought about. But I think what this shows, this dilemma that I just heard for the first time now, that people have, it shows that the lack of literacy and the lack of the knowledge of your own past, that is frightening. That is scary. And we all should be worried about that we don't know our own past. And the Malaysians have forgotten stories that happened 80 years ago, 100 years ago, that you've forgotten that. That is worrying. Now, important, I'm not going to address this issue in the way people asked the question. But one of the things we need to understand that the issue in Islam is all about intellectual diversity. So for instance, this hadith that talks about ikhtilafu ummati rahmah, that disagreement amongst my ummah is rahmah. There's a great scholar by the name of Mir Sayyid Jurjani, Sayyid Sharif al-Jurjani. Jurjani is a major figure in the canonical tradition. Wrote a commentary on Al-Iji's Mawaqif. In the South Asian madrasas, they read his books in grammar and Nahu Mir and Sarf Mir and all those books by Mir. He's known as Mir Sayyid Sharif. He's of Persian origin. He argues that this hadith itself basically encourages scholars to be competitive with each other and develop the best of ideas. That ikhtilafu ummah means that you must compete fil khairat. You must be competitive and come up with better solutions than the other person. So intellectual diversity is from the get-go something that is encouraged. So intellectual diversity, that the question that Dr. Adis raised, is the question about, how do you deal with diversity? I think Professor Alatas answered the question, is that the historical conditions will make some things feasible and other things not feasible. But the historical conditions, what we need to strive for would be optimal possibility. So you can have historical conditions that will make, say, only one view is right. We need to create the space that multiple views can be right, or multiple views can be practiced, but we must have the right and the freedom to debate each other. So we might be incompatible, or what we call, that incommensurable ideas that we have. So incommensurability is fine. When Omar deals with Abdullah ibn Abbas says, I will practice mut'ah. Mut'ah is not, temporary marriage has not been prohibited. Omar, using his state power, says, if you do mut'ah, I'm going to punish you for adultery, right? At least they had that conversation. And we don't know that Omar, and therefore the Muslims keep on disagreeing, that some believe that mut'ah and temporary marriage was never stopped by the Prophet, and others believe it was stopped, or that state policy stopped it, and so on. So there are always divisive issues. So for instance, a country like South Africa, we have a vast number of people that follow African custom, okay? South Africa also has a very liberal constitution. That constitution has to accommodate both polygyny and monogamy. Very divisive issue. These are not issues that you can solve. You can work out the ethics of the ethics of monogamy, right? But they are lived realities of cultures and practices and so on. I mean, once upon a time, I still think that monogamy is one of the best ways, but it might work well in urban areas, in different kinds of spaces and so on. I no longer have a perfectly right and wrong view on this issue. I believe that these are issues that communities should strive and figure out, and women should have a voice in that. So for instance, we know from the get-go on this issue that Ali radiallahu anhu wanted to marry another wife, and the Prophet told Ali that Fatima is of me, Fatima is of me, what hurts her hurts me, and immediately Ali got the message, right? What hurts her hurts me. Yudhiha ma yudhini, okay? What hurts her hurts me. The Prophet himself had multiple wives, but he also had emotions that it might not be the best for his daughter, and he made it public, and Ali got the message. So this issue is a complex issue. It's not a simple issue, right? And there's no way that we can work it out with rational ethics. In sometimes it works out that one spouse cannot give birth to children, and they are generous enough to say, have another one. But other times it is deeply offensive and say, you're not going to marry another wife, and we're going to adopt somebody. We're going to adopt a child. There are different ways you can deal with this. So there's no strict way of dealing with it, and we must be open-minded enough to understand that these very intractable, difficult issues, there will always be diversity, and there will always be difference. The question about difference between authoritarian and authoritative. Authoritarian is the one that you coerce other people into a viewpoint without giving them a choice to think about it, and coercive. Authoritative is where something has epistemological legs, and something is authoritative when there are more than one group of people supporting it. There could be dissenting voices, but the authoritative one is the one that has the strongest consensus on its side. But sometimes you find that the one with the strongest consensus on its side might not be the most persuasive. That then you have to go in traditions like Islam, Judaism, Christianity, especially Judaism and Islam. We always recorded the minority opinions of the past, that the minority opinions of the past sometimes can give you relief in that they might not be the most consensus-driven, but they have the best rationale that we can use today to make certain things possible. So for instance, this question about can Muslim women, could women who converted to Islam, who are in perfectly good marriages with their non-Muslim spouses, can they remain in those marriages or not? The classical view was that a conversion means end of marriage. And especially a Muslim woman cannot remain married to a non-Muslim man. European Council of Fatwa and Research, after a lot of soul searching, found a minority opinion that makes it possible that a woman who converts to Islam and the husband doesn't object to her conversion, don't have to break up the marriage. Don't have to break up the marriage. And they say that the wife should continue inviting the husband to Islam, but they're no longer asking for tafriq. That is European Council of Fatwa and Research. And now this is a longer sociological, I can't go into the reasoning right now, but it's important to think about that. The question that you raised about the fragmentation of religious authority. One of the things that we challenge by our time challenges us that Arjun Appadurai talks about two kinds of globalization. He calls vertebral globalization and cellular globalization. Vertebral globalization was the one in which, like a vertebra, the back, that there's a central nervous system that runs through the whole thing. There's central control of the message, central message control, okay? So Islamic orthodoxy historically was also central messaging with lots of tentacles, okay? It's like a central nervous system. You have different places. What you now have is cellular globalization. Cellular globalization means that there is no more central messaging. Exactly ISIS. Exactly what is happening now, that there's globalization happening. There's no central messaging. Everybody accepts the piece that they have and they run with it. And cellular globalization is very powerful, is very persuasive. So for instance, so you can go under the radar of the state. So the Arab Spring, all these kinds of developments that are happening now is happening through cellular globalization, okay? Anti-Islamophobia, for instance, my view, Islamophobia on a global level goes through cellular globalization. Very discrete anti-Muslim religious groups, they don't communicate in the New York Times and the Guardian and newspapers anymore about anti-Islam. It's through the internet. So for instance, my student JR, who's now becoming a doctor at Baltimore, at Johns Hopkins, one day shows me an email he gets from his grandmother. JR is very upset. He took an Islam class with me, now he's upset. He says, see what my grandmother writes. Somebody sent his grandmother an email to say that this shop in this mall in Virginia will be closed on this day. It happened to be September 11, this shop is going to be closed. It happened to be that September 11 coincided with an Eid day, with a day of Eid. So this Muslim shop was closed. Somebody took the picture, then sent it around and said, you know what is this? This is a day that all Muslims celebrate the destruction of the Twin Towers. And you know who's Imam Ali? Because it also coincided, or it was not, it coincided with Ashura. And something of that sort, Imam Hussein. And you know who was Imam Hussein? One of the 13 Saudi hijacked, one of the 17 hijacked. And JR's grandmother swallows it up. JR's grandmother doesn't know. The believability, the gentleman asked about the impacts of other communities. People can believe anything about Muslims today. You can say that, you know, Muslims believe that the moon doesn't exist, people will believe it. Because Muslims have lost, the projection of Muslim image is that the world has lost trust with Muslims. I'm afraid to say. People can believe anything about Muslims today. And you know what? Muslims are not worried about that. That's their problem, not our problem, they say. And that question is that about how do you establish trust? That JR's mother could believe this. There are lots of that. In the plane ride now coming in at 13 hours sitting next to an Australian couple who live in the UK. It's amazing. The kind of beliefs that people have about Muslims or what they think about it. They're just too happy that they sat with me that I saved them from thinking like that. They were so grateful for the kind of conversation we got. Because I was not defensive. I said, there are enough crazies that we have that believe that immediately breaks the logjam of conversation. Okay? Now you have a rational conversation and say, you know, can you believe this? Can you believe that? So the question of, I think the conditions under cellular globalization make certain things possible. It makes the fragmentation even more diverse. But there's also a boon that you don't have central messaging anymore. So what must you do? The way to combat this is not to get counter-central messaging. The job now is that how do you inoculate people, how do you immunize people against problematic beliefs? The immunization process of groups like ours must be more intense. And the immunization process is greater complexity, greater learning, greater outreach. And I believe that, and I'm going to end here, is that the question that we have, the biggest crisis is that the crisis in Islamic education is the biggest crisis. Not only, it's among the ulama, it begins right there. Muslim religious leadership have a very thin knowledge of the tradition. They don't even know the knowledge of the day, leave alone the knowledge of the past. The knowledge of the past is they have very thin understanding of that, don't understand it properly, but because they study Al-Azhar or Medina or Nadwatul Ulama where I studied, they come back, or my brother Ahmed Muhajir is here, you studied with me at Nadwatul Ulama. So we have that badge. Now suddenly that gives you credibility. So people believe that credibility, but it's a very dangerous credibility. I mean, I know what we learned and what I had to learn, and I continue to learn, okay? Knowledge is an unending process, but we've been given very kind of dangerous understandings that knowledge is authoritative that we have, but this authoritative knowledge is also very, very thin. We don't learn the sociology. I mean, in fact, Ibn Khaldun knew more about sociology than many ulama know today. Ibn Khaldun understood better political systems than what many ulama today living in nation states know. I mean, and that is almost 600 years ago. So I believe that Islamic education. Then the other kind of crisis that we have is this Islamization slogan. Now I know his uncle did a lot of work in Islamization, and I'm not going to attack his uncle, because he might defend his uncle. No, I'm only joking. And his uncle had a particular view of Islamization. Then there's another view of Islamization that came, Ismail Farouqi's notion of one. Both these people had very good intentions about what they meant by Islamization. They were concerned about Islamic identity. Najib al-Attaz had a concern about the epistemology of Islamic tradition that he wanted to preserve, that how that epistemology and the notions of ontology that had to be preserved for tradition, and he's concerned about modernity undermining that tradition. And then on the other hand, you had Ismail Farouqi that said, modern Muslims must be taught Islamic tradition, and traditional ulama must be taught the modern tradition, okay? But what happened in that project is that they did not get legs further. You cannot live, as Prof. Al-Attaz pointed out, that living in the modern world, you cannot just be based on tradition. Tradition also has to breathe, and you have to renew the tradition. Because some of the conditions under which the tradition was composed in the past, those conditions no longer are existent. And so you have to remake the tradition. And modernity is also a tradition. And therefore we have to keep on, there's a dialectic between the two things. But what happened, Islamization becomes a ghetto and sloganizing exercise. And what that means is that Muslims do not learn the knowledge of their times. Not even critically, leave alone passively. So what is happening is that in the Islamic tradition, knowledge of Islam is now today completely insulated from knowledge around it. And that was not the world of Ibn Rushd or Ibn al-Ghazali or the world of Ibn Khaldun. And so Islamic knowledge today, what we call Islamic traditional knowledge, is suffocated. It is it's in the emergency room. It's on life support. And what it really needs is a revitalization by reading the tradition and renewing the tradition and re-energizing the tradition. But that means a lot of work and the retrieval of the logics of tradition also, to make sense of it and to renew it and to create new fibers in it. And I think that's one of the biggest crises we have. But what is happening is a lot of identity projects and a lot of kind of sloganizing that we think replaces learning and insight. Thank you.
Yeah, okay.
I just wanted to also add, because I think I didn't answer the question about other religions. Yeah, I won't spend much time on that because I'll discuss it more in the next session. But I just want to say this. What is the relationship between Islam and other religions, and what is the a related issue is the role of interreligious dialogue. That's something which is very much undeveloped in Malaysia, the interreligious dialogue. And you see, a lot of people think that interreligious dialogue is not effective because it refers to a bunch of religious leaders getting together and saying nice things about each other, and then that's the end of it, right? Now, this is not true. Successful dialogue is very important. I'll give you the case of Singapore, where I know a Methodist pastor, an ex-bishop, who is so sympathetic to Islam that he spends a great deal of time and energy correcting misconceptions of Islam among Christians. This can only come about when there is close, genuine understanding between religious leaders. Hindu priests, Buddhist monks, pastors, priests, imams. If they are close to each other, and they trust each other, and they know about each other's religion, then they will correct the misunderstandings about other religions to their own respective congregations. So this, I think, is very important, and we have not, I think, we are not progressing on this front as far as Malaysia is concerned. I also just wanted to say that, for what we've been talking about today, we say there's a problem of education, and there's a need to re-educate our people and to prevent the next generation from falling into extremism. Because the way things are developing in Malaysia, and I think it's true of other Muslim communities, there's increasing influence of extremism, sometimes supported by bureaucrats, by politicians. Changing the formal system is difficult, so there's a need to develop informal means of educating people. I also want to suggest that apart from education, I think we're going to be seeing in Malaysia more and more forms of legal civil disobedience. And I think that's actually a good development. But let me stress legal civil disobedience. I want to touch a dog. It was actually called I Want to Touch a Dog campaign or something. It's an example of that. And I'm inspired by that. I'm thinking that we should, where was that held? Near Wan Utama, isn't it? We should go to, one day organize something. We should all go to Wan Utama. It will be called I Want to Say Salamu Alaikum. Now, Muslims and non-Muslims go there to Wan Utama, get together, maybe also bring your dogs and cats and all that. That's another matter. Get together and say Salamu Alaikum and Alaikum Salam to each other, Muslims and non-Muslims. This is what I mean by legal civil disobedience. Because it is telling the authorities, please don't tell us how to be Muslims. Right? You have your opinion, and you are allowed to have your opinion. We also have our views, and we will act according to our views. I think more and more of these kinds of actions for the people, all Malaysian people, Muslims as well as non-Muslims, telling the government that this is how we understand Islam, and this is how we want to be Muslims. Leave us alone to be Muslims in that way, and then we will also support you. This is what it needs to come to, but it's not come to that. Lastly, I want to say, being in touch with tradition, to be a better Muslim. We were talking about dogs. Did I tell you the story, did I ever tell you the story of the pig? I never told you the story about the pig. It's a very important story. It's a short, very short story. There was a philosophical society of sorts, the Ikhwanus Safa, 10th century. They wrote a very interesting story called, it's been translated into English, translated as The Lawsuit of Animals Against Humanity. Right? You know the story. So to cut a long story short, a ship of humans gets shipwrecked on an island, right? And the humans are stuck on the island because their ship is destroyed. So they live on the island. Now, before the humans arrive on the island, there are only animals and plants. And these animals and plants have been living there in peace and harmony. When the humans arrive, after some time, the humans get hungry. They start to eat the plants, and they start to kill the animals and eat the animals. So after a while, the animals get together and say, this is very difficult, we can't continue like this. So they decide to bring the humans to court. There is a trial, and the humans are found guilty of crimes against animals. And some of the animals, like the dragon, says, we should execute them, we should kill them, I will burn them, I will put them on fire, with my breath. But one animal says, we should not do this to the humans, because if we simply kill them off, we are no better than them. And that animal who came to the rescue of the humans was the pig. Very interesting. It tells you about what these philosophers, and this was a very important philosophical group, the Ikhwanus Safa, what they call them, the Brethren of Purity. What would they think? They certainly did not revile the pig. Otherwise, they would not have given this honor to the pig. Secondly, it may mean that they knew something about the pig. As modern science, understands the pig to be among the more intelligent of animals. The pig is higher on the hierarchy of intelligence of animals. So perhaps they knew something about this. But I'm giving an example of this, just to say that when we are in touch with tradition, we would, perhaps it's ironic, be more modern and more at home in the world, and more, inclusivist and more cosmopolitan. For that reason, we need to be in touch with tradition, not simply for nostalgic reasons, not simply to become more authentic Muslims, but to be more modern Muslims.
Thank you. Thank you very much.